Hey, and welcome back, guys. This is session number 44 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Since we're jumping into chapter 13 now, let's just set the scene here, okay? Chapter 13 is actually the longest block of teaching in the entire Gospel of Mark. And it's very apocalyptic, if you want to use that word, meaning that there's some stuff in this particular chapter that you would find in the book of Revelation rather than the book of Mark, but it is here. And it reads like a farewell discourse, last words of leaders in the Old Testament like Moses or Joshua. And here we find a few of Jesus's disciples asking him a question about the end times. And we'll explore that question and Jesus's answer in this session. So let's go ahead and dive right into the text, why don't we? It begins like this. And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished?" Now, let's set the tone here. Let's set the setting here. Okay, Jesus here is sitting on the Mount of Olives, which is opposite the temple. Now, two quick notes here. He's opposite the temple, right? Mark is very clear to point that out. So this is not just a physical position, but also a spiritual one, right? Jesus has been dealing with the temple for the past several chapters, going in, cleansing the temple. So he's not only opposite the temple physically at this point, he's also opposite the temple spiritually, because what's been going on in the temple hasn't been pleasing. So he sits here opposite the temple spiritually, and he's sitting in a position of a teacher, because in this culture, teachers would actually sit as they taught. So he's about to do some teaching, and look who asked him the question. What's so important about these four guys in this text? Well, first of all, they're the first four people to be called in the gospel, called to follow Jesus, right? And then second, this was the inner circle of Jesus. We know about Peter, James, and John, right? But then it adds another one, Andrew, right? Because the first three usually hang out with Jesus when he does cool stuff, transfiguration, healings. But then Andrew is here. So he's asked to join them this time. Remember, Andrew is Peter's brother. So apparently Peter let him tag along this time around. And they've got a question for Jesus. What is that question? Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are about to be accomplished? Now, what things are they talking about? As you may have noticed, we jumped in verse number 3, and we've been talking about this our entire time together. When you jump into a text in the middle of a text, make sure you go and read what's before the text and what's after the text. So here you would at least have to read verses 1 and 2. And in those verses, you learn this, that Jesus came out of the temple and the disciples said, "Look at this wonderful building and these wonderful stones." And Jesus then replies, "There's not going to be one stone left on this building that will not be thrown down." Jesus is a party pooper, right? So they asked the natural question that would come to mind after him saying that there won't be one stone on this building. When? When is this going to happen? And what are the signs that are going to accomplish? And what are the signs that are going to let us know that these things are going to be accomplished? So they ask when and what are going to be the signs. So the Greek word for signs is semeion. And it's going to be a very important word here. The Pharisees had used it in Mark chapter 8, right? When they demanded Jesus a sign from Jesus. And the disciples here also mention what are going to be the signs of the end time. Okay. And then it says, Jesus began to say to them, "See that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name saying, 'I am he.' They will lead many astray." Now, here he uses a word that we have to look at, because it's going to be a word that we see repeated over and over and over again. This word "see" in the Greek actually is a word that is something we need to make sure we know about, is blepete. Blepete. And blepete literally means watch out. Watch out, right? He tells the disciples to watch out for a couple of different things. The first thing he tells them to watch out for is false teachers or messiahs. Now, over Christian history, the biggest threats to the church haven't been those outside the church. Actually, it's been those inside the church. Today, there are still men and women out there who lead others astray when it comes to gospel faithfulness. And that's what Jesus warns the disciples here in this text. Don't believe these false prophets or these false messiahs, right? So many false prophets and messiahs have come and go, just as Jesus teaches here, which is why he says, see, or blepete, watch out, be on the lookout for them, right? And then he talks about something else. He talks about political disasters. When you hear about wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place, but the end is not yet. Christians across the centuries, again, have experienced this, right? But it was very true of Mark's audience. We talk about the first century audience, right? So shortly after Jesus' time, an emperor tried to put a statue of himself in the temple, which is a big no-no for the Jews. No idols in the temple, which generated rumors that the Jews were going to go to war. And those rumors actually became a reality in 66 AD when the Jews revolted. Remember, we talked about zealots. If we didn't, the zealots were a group of Jewish people who were zealous for the nation of Israel and were willing to go to war. So they revolted in 66 AD. Unfortunately, they were defeated and the temple was destroyed. But Jesus says the end is not yet. So even though I'm telling you about these things that are going to occur, I want to give you a qualifier. Don't look at those things, because when those things happen, the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And here's the third thing that he mentions here. There are going to be natural disasters, earthquakes in various places, and famines. Interestingly, a earthquake struck in 61 AD, right? And also tore up Pompeii. You may have heard of Pompeii in 64 AD. So Jesus is predicting things that are going to be happening over the next several decades, much less next several centuries, right? So Jesus, let's just be clear here, okay? He's not going all emo on us, right? And talking about destruction for no reason at all. Remember, he's got one message for the disciples. If there's one message in this passage that you want to take away, it's watch out. Don't be thinking about the end right now. I need you to watch what's going on right now, here in your present moment, right? There's stuff that is happening around you that you need to There's stuff that is happening around you that you need to remain watchful about, right? Then Jesus says, but be on your guard, for they will deliver you over to councils. You'll be beaten in synagogues. You will stand before governors and kings for my sake to bear witness before them. And the gospel must first be proclaimed to all nations. What is Jesus saying here? Well, again, we see something that we need to be watchful. There it is again, the same word translated differently, but the blepete is the watch out. Same word used here. And the key thought here is in this latter versions of and the key thought here in the latter verse, and the key part here in this part of the verse is about persecution, right? Persecution is to be expected. This is actually a part of Christian life. In fact, if we look at the text, persecution is actually a prerequisite to the gospel proclaimed to all the nations. It says, and the gospel must first be proclaimed to all the nations, right? So in the text here, he's saying this. Then he says this, and when in fact, persecution is actually a prerequisite to the gospel being proclaimed to all the nations. That's the sign that the believers need to be most mindful of, is that the gospel be proclaimed to all the nations, because gospel proclamation naturally leads to persecution. We saw this in the book of Acts, right? The believers in Acts experienced just what Jesus is saying here in this text. And then he says, when they bring you to trial, he's going to encourage them here. He gives them good news in the midst of persecution. He says, when they bring you to trial and deliver you over, don't be anxious beforehand what you're going to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Let's look at this last section here. The Spirit is present and active here in the persecuted life. All those fear and all that fear and all that anxiety, that's all that fear and all that anxiety that we see in the first part of this text, it gives way to boldness and confidence. Again, if you go look at the book of Acts, you see the word bold, you see the word confident, you see confident people, confident that the Spirit is at work in the midst of their persecution. So the Spirit is present and active in the persecuted life, right? And he says, brother will deliver brother over to death, and father his child and children. This is just crazy to see that it also breaks up families. That these end times that are going to happen are going to be breaking up families as well. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. Let's look at this last part of this verse, the one who endures to the end. Now, you can look at this in first glance and say, oh, I just need to work and endure to the end. Then I will be saved. That's not what Jesus is getting at here. This isn't a salvation by works, but it's a demonstration that genuine faith is actually revealed through our trials and our tribulation. That endurance shows people that we are faith-filled Christians who serve a faithful God who will save us and rescue us from that persecution. So what's the takeaway here for this text? I think it's this, that the disciples and others asked Jesus for a sign of the future, but Jesus directed them to the present. And here's the question for us. What about me? What about you? Are we asking Jesus more about our future? And in what way is Jesus directing you to the present when you ask him about the future? How are you living in this moment? How are you living in the blepete, in the watch out moment that you are in right now? How can we focus more on the present and being present in a culture that actually values neither? How can we do that? That's what Jesus is getting at here. He's saying, don't look at the signs. The only sign that you need to look at is that this gospel is being proclaimed to the nations. That's the sign I want you to remember. That's the sign that I want you to look at. And that's the sign that I want you to live your life every day, to share the gospel with a broken and hurting world. All right, folks, that's been session number 43. All right, folks, that's been session number 44 of our exploration of the Gospel of Mark. Next go round, we're going to session number 45. We're going to talk about the abomination of desolation. Yeah, that's kind of crazy, but we're going to work our way through it. Can't wait. Looking forward to it. See you next go round. Bless, grace, and peace to you all.